Let me start. Hi, this is Lynda Logan in Phoenix, Arizona, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Anthony Marr, who is a winning activist. In 1999, he was featured as the champion of the Bengal tiger in the 5-season TV documentary series Champions of the Wild, aired on Discovery Channel and Animal Planet in 20 countries. A decade later, during the prestigious Animal Rights 2010 National Conference in Washington, D.C., attended by over 1,000 activists, he was honored with the Henry Spear Grassroots Activist Award for his outstanding contribution to animal liberation. Earlier the same year, the AR Group Negotiation is Over, as reported by the Radical Animal Liberation Front, bestowed upon him the title of Best All-Around Activist with the following accolade by NEO founder Camille A. Marino, a courageous and pure-hearted activist who has been severely punished for her no-compromise approach. Whether protecting tiger reserves in India, risking his life in an undercover investigation of the illegal trade in endangered species parks, challenging any and all forms of hunting, hosting a radio show, writing visionary books on science, philosophy, and cosmology, embarking on marathon coast-to-coast Compassion for Animals road expeditions covering dozens of U.S. states, or mobilizing scientific research to awaken the complacent to the imminent dangers of irreversible ecological crisis, Anthony Marr is raising awareness, effectively campaigning, and blazing new trails. Anthony, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I met you so many years ago on your Compassion for Animals road expedition when you came to New Jersey to help us out with the black bear situation. And now, recently, we've become reacquainted and talking about the issues facing the wild horses in the United States and the BLM plans for roundups. So I thank you for taking the time to talk to me today and explain the unprecedented problem that we have with wild horses and the horrible current conditions and the unprecedented solution that you are putting forth.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yes, my heart is in the heart and soul actually is into preserving the planet and all the life on it and the entire biosphere if it is within my power. And wild horses have become the focal point of my annual liberation campaigns, partly because horses are very dear to my heart. My family name Marr in Chinese means horse, so I was pretty much fated to be the champion at some point in my life. And I'm now 76 years old, so if I don't do it now, I may run out of gas. So I'm giving it full steam ahead for the horses, wild horses.
Awesome, awesome. So here in Arizona, we have a couple of areas where we're lucky enough to have wild horses, but those who oppose them always bring up the fact that they're feral, and we counter with the fact that they're wild. Why is it important to distinguish between the two? What is a wild horse versus a feral horse?
It is very important because it is a matter of right that people can recognize. If you hailed originally from a certain place, you have a certain right to that place. And if you have come from some other place, then you may not have that birthright in that particular place. And the distinguishing between the word feral and the word wild is very important. And if you allow me a couple of minutes to delineate, a feral horse is, for example, if you have a thoroughbred mare and somehow you are negligent enough to let the horse escape, and the horse just goes one way and doesn't return right into the wild, and and eats other living. That horse I would consider to be feral within its own lifetime. However, if that horse, or if more than one horse have gone feral and they have begun to multiply in the wild and beget offspring, and after a little while, you can still argue the first generation, second generation, but what about the third, the fourth, the 10th generation? I mean, they have become wild because they have not only established a foothold and a livelihood upon the land, they have also um, reestablished their own roots because the horse's origin is in North America. It is approximately where today's Wyoming is located. That's where the first fossils of the ancestral horse species were found. And that was about 50 million years ago. And then through the ages, it has evolved into several species. Eventually, after about 8 or 9, it gave rise to the Equus family, and then the horses of the modern type. And so if you just trace the direct lineage backwards, you will arrive at that point of origin, and that is right here where you live in North America. And it has been interrupted a little bit according to conventional wisdom. When the end of the Ice Age came around 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, a lot of megafauna became extinct, perhaps due to human interference or intervention or influence. And the wild horse is said to have gone along with the woolly mammoth and the cave bear and the saber-tooth tiger and all that. However, there is a branch of thought that a certain small population may have persisted, and that is not necessary to establish the horse being native. But it is interesting to say that there was a certain line of thought that the wild horse, the original wild horse, did not go extinct in North America, but persisted in a local basis into today's wild horse. And then, in the meantime, we have to look back into, say, maybe a million years ago, maybe a little bit less far back, some branch of the, during the Ice Age, the land bridge at the Bering Strait is on. So animals can cross from North America to Asia and vice versa, as the humans did from Asia to North America. But the wild horses, original wild horses, or some branch of it, they moved across into Asia, and from there they would begin to disperse, due west and due south, and some settled right in Asia itself, and some would go farther into Europe, and some would go farther into Europe, Spain, and in Spain, the wild horses gradually changed into the barb type, the Spanish barb, and then it is that type which the Spaniards carried back over into South America, and which struck awe into the hearts of the Incas, thinking that they were gods. And so those were the barb horses that the Spanish moved back over, which eventually became the foundation stock of particularly of the horses in the Salt River region, as far as I'm aware. You can correct me in that. But so the Spanish stock came back in and reestablished itself, and became the foundational stock of the Mustangs. But in the meantime, a lot of other people, like farmers and ranchers and so on, sometimes deliberately allowed the horses to go feral, and then some of them to not return. They would, for example, feed them, free feed them in the wild and collect them back or something. And some of them just ran away, and that also contributed to the wild horse stock as well. So the modern Mustang is actually depending on where you find them. If it's near, say, Arizona, it would be more like the Spanish type. Whereas if you go to some of the regions, like the Northeast or something like that, it could be a mixture of that, as well as some other types and some other breeds, including draft horses. So so that's why the modern Mustang has a wide range of phenotypes, and but the fact of the matter is that the horse has always been here, or if it has taken a tiny little hiatus of several hundred years over millions of years, gone to Europe for a little stretch, and come back home to roost, they remain, as far as I'm concerned, the native species of the public lands, as opposed to the cows that right now seem to have a much greater right than the horses on these lands, because the cows themselves originated from Asia and Europe, not from North America, as well as the Europeans who came over and became ranchers. They are also from another land. So in this scenario, the horse has always been here. They originated from here. They are native, and they are here to stay. Whereas the cows and the ranchers have come from Asia and Europe, and they are the invasive species. So we have to recognize that and respect the wild horses for it, and don't try to twist it around and call it feral, because that is very derogatory and untrue.
Right, right, and thank you so much for that explanation. That really solidifies the argument that the horses were here first, and I think that is a key part of this, because as we know now, the situation facing wild horses in the United States is very dire. Their history includes being rounded up by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, being slaughtered, being rounded up using very cruel methods like helicopters, and horses and young foals die during the roundups if they're not rounded up and then slaughtered. And now we have a new plan, which they're calling the Path Forward, which, if you look a little bit under the surface, is definitely not a path forward, and that's what we're here to talk about. So the facets of the current situation is that we have 2 million head of cattle grazing on the public lands, which, again, reminder, belongs to the public, not the cattle ranchers. And we have fewer than 100,000 wild horses. So in part of, on your website at marrplan.org, which is marr-plan.org, there's a very good explanation of the ratio of the cattle versus the wild horses, and how the BLM comes up with pretty much random numbers of how many horses they want to allow on the land. And one of the things I've learned in working with various wildlife organizations in the past is that there's a big difference between the biological carrying capacity of the land, meaning how many animals can the environment biologically sustain, versus the cultural carrying capacity of the land, which is what will the people allow. And I think the situation facing the wild horses today is not at all a biological carrying capacity argument. And I would make arguments that the wild horses are very beneficial to the land, but versus the cultural carrying capacity. And in this case, it's not what the public will allow, it's what the government and the cattle ranchers will allow, because I think it's been demonstrated that the public is overwhelmingly supportive of the wild horse population, but we're up against a very powerful cattle lobby. So if you could explain a bit about what the current situation is, what is happening right now, because we've seen all the horrific videos of the roundups, and seeing those wild stallions separated from their bands and kept in holding pens indefinitely for years is just completely heartbreaking. So if you could explain a bit about what's going on right now, and then we can talk about solutions for a true path forward.
Okay. Let me go back in time a little bit. You said right now, but I'll lead back up to it. But I would like to continue where I left off, which means so the Mustangs were on the land, and the Spanish brought it before the ranches, and other feral horses joined in. So came the 20th century. There was no protection for the so-called feral horses at that point. So people can do whatever they want with them. If you've got a truck, if you've got if you know how to, lasso animals, if you're a cowboy, you are free to go and, go to find a Mustang herd and then just capture whatever you want with ropes and so on and so forth, and then bring them back home and do whatever you want with them. maybe turn them into riding horses, sell them, kill them for meat, sell them for meat, whatever. It's all open, wild, a wild custom at that point. It's like a Wild West of the 20th century, really. And there was even a movie made of it called The Misfits in the 1950s, starring Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, and Montgomery Clift. And that's the theme of how these wranglers go and grab wild horses and do what they do with them. And that movie probably had a big impact on the public consciousness, because people then began to very much be opposed to that. So as a result of whatever social sentiment there may be, the U.S. government decided to do something to answer the public's call. And at that point, there was such a government department called the U.S. Grazing Service. Okay, mark down the word grazing, the U.S. Grazing Service, that the U.S. government changed into the Bureau of Land Management. So that's the root of the BLM, is grazing. So let's just get that part straight. The nomenclature, there's a good reason for that. So in 1971 was when that happened. The government came down with this new law to protect wild horses and wild burros against that kind of activity. That means going to grab them, going to round them up, catch them, slaughter. And so that was supposed to be, on the surface, pretty good, because then people can't just go and grab horses anymore from the wild. However, horses are still being grabbed, except by something else, which is by the BLM. And the reason is this: they want to, and of course the BLM, whose previous incarnation, being the U.S. Grazing Service, has already established huge and very intimate and very intricate relations with cattle ranches. So that is basically the mission on the surface to, according to the name of the law, which Wild Horses and Burros Protection Act, it is all about cattle, really. And the horses actually comes as a footnote, because the number of cattle are allowed to almost reach their own maximum allowable population, given the carrying capacity of the land, and they just gave a little bit to the horse. So in 1971, when that law came down, the BLM set the maximum allowable concentration, or the technical jargon being the appropriate management level, again meaning maximum allowable population, and set it for a maximum of approximately 27,000, 26.6 really, 27,000 approximately wild horses allowed on the land. And at that point, I don't have the exact information then, nor do I know that such information exists, but I would guess that's an educated guesstimate that at that point the cattle population and the horse population could easily reach 40 to 1. At one point it is demonstrated to be 37 to 1. That means 37 cows per horse. That's the ratio. So the BLM, working on that kind of a formula, said, okay, there's so many cows on the land, and therefore a small percentage for the horse would equal 27,000 horses allowed on the entire public lands, which is absolutely minuscule, because the horses population used to be about 2 million. And the 2 million has been taken over by the cows. And the government shows huge generosity to allow 27,000 horses to remain. That is absolutely, I cannot find a word for it that I want to repeat on the air. But, but anyway,
I have a question on that, Anthony, before you go further. So,
sure.
In terms of grazing, when they get to this 37 cows to one horse, which I understand is now down to 20 cows per one horse, don't cows and horses eat about the same or require the same from the land? So why are so many cattle considered an appropriate management level, yet so few horses when they consume exactly the same resources?
All right. So let's say, suppose we find a piece of land that can support, let's say, 1,000 horses. Okay. With the natural resources to support 1,000 horses, and horses and cows eat approximately the same amount, even though they eat differently, and certainly excrete very differently. And we can touch on that a bit later about the beneficial effect of horses in the land versus cows. So it is equated 1 horse to 1 cow on a monthly basis. So 1 cow and 1 horse on a monthly basis would be equal on the land. However, ranchers don't graze cattle on the land all year round. They graze it only part of the year, let's say about half a year, 6 months. So in other words, on a per year basis, I would say that 1 horse equals to 2 cows, because 1 horse grazes year round and the cow grazes only 6 months per year. So I'm sorry, what was the question again? I've wandered off.
So my question was, if one horse consumes the same resources as 2 cows in any given year, why is the ratio so skewed according to the BLM? Why is their acceptable level 20 to 1?
Well, that's got nothing to do with the biological carrying capacity of the land. It has everything to do with how many cows the BLM wants on the land.
Right, that's my point.
Yeah,
it has nothing to do with natural resources or biology or science. It's an arbitrary figure that the BLM has come up with to appease the cattle ranchers, basically.
Yeah, that's right. As I mentioned earlier, they used, before the cows came, there used to be about 2 million horses, according to some sources. And so, 2 million horses equals 2 million cows. So, therefore, I'm talking about, let me see, horses. Back then, I would say that they are using the arbitrarily, because that is how many cows there are to be grazed, and they want to accommodate as many as possible, but they don't want to wipe out the horses, because the people love the horses, even though they love to eat beef as well. And that is a big conflict in the public. I love the horses, but I love to eat beef. Therefore, more horses and more cows in the land.
Right. So if fewer people were eating meat and fewer cows were needed, that would really help out the wild horse population
in the long run.
And honestly, what's standing between us and total annihilation of horses in the wild is people who are speaking out against roundups. So I think it's really important to emphasize that the general public is the only reason why there are still any wild horses anywhere. So that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is to bring more attention to the fact that the horses need us to speak up and be active in their defense. Because we're up against a lot of money in the cattle lobby.
They're huge, and in fact, they are very elitist as well. Most of the cattle grazed on the public lands are not, little mom and pop, cattle raisers with about 20 cows, things like that. It's thousands and thousands of cows per cattle baron, and these are the guys who get to graze on public land. And to make things worse, other than being elitist, it is also economically objectionable, because there's such a term as welfare ranching. And welfare ranching is the also privilege of the super rich. Now, just let me run this again. Welfare ranching is for the super rich ranchers. Now, that makes that that makes a lie of one of these two words. I don't know which one's a lie. But the U.S. I think is spending $250 million on welfare ranching, and that amount is spent in terms of giving them the privilege of very cheap grazing on public land. For example, if these rich cattle barons graze their land on private land, they would have to pay some kind of a grazing fee, and it could go up to maybe $20 per month per cow. But the BLM charges them only $1.35, $1.40 per cow per month. So
Wow.
that's how this welfare system works, is that the government gives huge discounts to these super rich cattle ranchers, cattle barons, to let the cows graze on the land. So of course they're extremely powerful, and they can call a lot of shots on the government. And so the horses have been pretty much, pushed into a tiny corner, figuratively speaking anyway. So, and also, according to the horse's nature, the BLM have distributed the horses on paper and in diagram form and on the map in terms of horse management areas. And these herd management areas, there are about over 200 of them, 250 of them. And according to ecological wildlife biology, for any population of any species, one single continuous population, a reproductive population, what you need to maintain reproductive health and genetic health and to prevent inbreeding would be approximately 250 breeding members. 250 breeding members. Now keep that in mind, because that is the number that I used in India when I was there working towards saving the Bengal tiger, or helping save the Bengal tiger, I should say. We have to do this to the bears, to the tiger's prey species, which is mainly the cheetal deer population, and also to a lesser extent the sambar deer population as well. And they certainly need 250 breeding members to maintain genetic health. So same applies to animals in America. So, but what I'm trying to say is, of the 200 and some odd HMAs, which is herd management areas, a lot of the AMLs, a lot of the maximum breeding population set for these HMAs are less than 200. Some of them as low as 100. In other words, they're saying, okay, this is a herd in this herd management area with 100 breeding members, period. So that invites genetic deterioration and inbreeding. So, and the government either knows about it and not practice, or doesn't know about it, which I doubt they would be so incompetent. But in any case, it is not much done. And so, to leap forward a little bit, if the MARR plan comes into action, I would certainly up all these AMLs in all these HMAs to be above 250 instead of 100 here, 150 there, maximum 200. The very odd ones, 250, something like that. So anyway, the entire wild horse scene, if you break it down herd by herd, it is not in particularly good shape. So back to 1971, they estimated so many cows on the land, and we can allow only so many horses, and they set it for 27,000 horses, when there were actually a lot more than that. But they did a cursory count, and they counted 26,000, and they kind of opportunistically named it at 26.6, just so that it includes every horse that they have counted. And then the second stage of thinking is now how do we maintain the 27,000, because the horses' reproduction would increase the size of the total population by between 10 to 20% a year, unless it is being hunted by native predators, mostly wolves and cougars, then they would be kept steady at 100%. But in the absence of wolves and cougars, the population would increase by about 10 to 15% or 20% max, which is usually the percentage that is taken out by the wolves and cougars were they present. But they've been all taken, mostly removed from the land where cattle graze by the ranchers, and for obvious reasons, and by hunters for less obvious reasons, which is that they consider wolves and cougars as competition for game against they themselves. So between the ranchers and the hunters, the wolves are pretty much gone effectively, and the cougars are, according to the Academy of Sciences. They say that they have hardly ever observed any wolf kills of wild horses in their tenure of observation, and they also said that the cougars have been driven so far back that the cougars habitat and the wild horse habitat hardly ever overlap anymore. So they're effectively absent, and in that situation, the horse population would increase by the amount that the predators would have taken. So the BLM then would say, okay, well, since the horse population will be on the increase, then we've got to find a way to keep it down to 27,000. So the way of one-step thinking is, okay, we're going to adopt out the wild horses. So at that point, they're riding high because partly because of the movie Misfits, the wild horses are pretty hot in the public consciousness at that point. So and there was also a certain momentum of the previous system of people wanting wild horses for whatever reason they want. So the BLM uses is thinking or plans or planned to use adoption as the sole means to control the wild horse population. So they would go out every year and do whatever count they do and say, okay, it's 27,000 right here, and there's, oh wow, 5,000 more probably from the previous year. So they would come and round up 5,000 and then try to adopt them. And in 1971, 72, 73, these first few years, the general public did want to adopt enough Mustangs to keep the population at 27,000 without any leftovers in holding. However, after a few years, the public interest waned, but the horses' reproduction doesn't wane, so the population keeps on increasing, and the BLM goes to round up whatever is they consider to be in excess of the 27,000. And since there is not enough people wanting to adopt them anymore, they would build these holding facilities to keep these horses. In principle, according to public wish against slaughter, they're going to keep these captive horses in these holding facilities for life. That means if you capture a horse at 4 years old, 3 years old, you're going to support it in these holding facilities until die of old age at 25, 30 years old. And they have even come up with a figure of $48,000 per horse in holding until they naturally pass away. So that obviously is a very expensive scheme, but they're stuck in this thing. They're stuck in this treadmill of grabbing horses, try to adopt as many as possible, and putting the excess into these holding facilities. And we don't need a scientist, an Einstein to figure out that they have to keep on building more and more and more holding facilities and using more and more and more helicopter time to round up more horses to put into these holding facilities, and feeding them and taking care of them and neutering all the stallions and neutering some of the females. And, so the whole thing just ran out of control in that way, and they never did change track. They followed that original formula, and that led to eventually in approximately 2017 or 18, they've run out of money they can't build any more holding facilities given the budget they have. And they still have to grab so many horses. and they got nowhere to put them. So that was the wild horse crisis in approximately 2018, when the holding facilities are declared all full, no more money to build some more anymore, and the question is open: where do we put all these horses to be rounded up? So, and of course, the public at once zooms to slaughter, and absolutely no, and it is so overwhelming. I would say that over 80% of the general public would be against slaughtering wild horses, would be against slaughtering horses, period, but especially wild horses, because of the extra genetic value, I suppose, and also aesthetic value. The land is far more beautiful with wild horses than without. And even if you don't see any wild horses out there in the wild, just the fact that you know they exist is gratifying enough. So that's at least the way I feel about it. So anyway, coming to 2018, there are approximately 47,000 to 50,000 wild horses crammed into all these holding facilities, and the BLM couldn't capture enough because they got nowhere to put them. So the wild population is set to have to burn up to about 90,000 come 2019. And of course, that's a lot. That's a very big number compared to the 27,000 that the BLM would allow. But so they're stuck, really. I mean, you know, they're stuck with 90,000 horses on the land that they have to, according to their own policy, round up 60-some odd thousand and dump them into nowhere, except the slaughterhouse that the general public vehemently oppose. So the BLM is pretty much stuck on that.
So Anthony, I have a question. This new plan that is called the Path Forward, how exactly did that come about, and why does it have the support of some national animal welfare organizations?
Okay, it is. Let me go back to 2018. Then 2018 was the year when the whole thing hit the wall, really. Previously, it was, you know, in previous years, it was, okay, there are, you know, 30,000, 40,000 horses now, and you allow 27,000. But, you know, things are getting tight and not enough money and so on. So the BLM says, okay, well, let's just put it on hold, and, you know, we'll deal with it in a little while or something like that. But the horses can't be put on hold. They just keep on their general life cycle. So then the BLM has a requirement. It has a requirement as to, they need a solution as to how to reduce the 90,000 wild horses in 2019, which has been allowed to accumulate due to shortage of money because they're running out of places to put them, and perhaps running out of money to running out of helicopter time due to, you know, monetary shortfalls. And so they're saying, all right, well, we've got 90,000 horses and we allow 27,000. So how are we going to deal with this? And so this kind of openly invites general feedback, I guess. And I don't know how much the BLM actually listen to the general public, but when a major animal rights group speaks up and offers a solution, BLM would listen. And there were two huge animal advocacy groups, three actually, who came up with a collective so-called solution. And the big two are the HSUS, the Humane Society of the United States, and the ASPCA, everybody knows what that is. And the third one is called RTF, which means Return to Freedom. It stands for Return to Freedom, which is one of the biggest misnomers I've ever heard in living memory. And so they collectively came up with a so-called solution. And basically, it's not a single solution, but a conglomerate of partial solutions that are hammered together by by approximately 50 interest groups that are invited into a certain committee to hammer out this solution. And of course, it's a committee. It's a committee product. And so the prime mission is to reduce the 90,000 horses down to 27,000 and find some way to put the 65,000 that are captured and without slaughtering them, at least without the general public knowing about that they are slaughtering them, even though the general public always suspects that a certain small amount or certain fairly large amount, I don't know, there's no statistics for it, of horses in captivity, wild horses in captivity have been channeled to meat merchants and meat buyers and so on. So everything is very murky. But what they came up with was a plan called, generally it is known as the path forward. It's a kind of patting themselves in the back when they're actually facing backward. So if they start walking forward, they're actually walking backward into a situation that's even worse than what the BLM is faced with in a final analysis. So basically, the slogan for their plan is 10 years to AML. So basically, it is brutally reduce the number of 90,000 horses spread over 10 years to suppress it back down to 27,000. And by brutally, I mean they have to round up 20,000 horses per year over the first 4, 5, or 6 years, and then build facilities to hold these 20,000 horses captured. They say 15 to 20,000 to house these 15 to 20,000 extra horses per year, year after year for several years at huge expense. And of course, to round up 20,000 wild horses by helicopter is no mean feat either, financially speaking. So,
right, and we've already committed $20 million to this, right? 20 million taxpayer dollars.
21 million to be exact, and that is according to their calculation. There's no direct linkage in saying this equals that, but I've always thought, okay, if they're going for some money, they'd be going for $21 million for this one purpose, and then another chunk for another purpose. And these two purposes are, number one, to get money to be able to use helicopters enough to be able to capture at least 15,000 horses this per year. And then the second, it would be to have another chunk of money to build more holding facilities to hold them every year, year after year. And that has been calculated to be about 35 million, and it hasn't even been dealt with or paid for by the Congress yet. But the Congress has approved $21 million, and that is for helicopter expenses, because they themselves calculated that to round up at least 15,000 wild horses, you would need at least $20 million worth of helicopter time. So that is, and in order to save a little bit of money, they are having a little bit of side solutions too. For example, instead of grabbing wild horses and putting them into holding facilities and holding pastures, they would rather brutally neuter a pretty high quantity of them using either permanent solutions such as by surgery, neutering male horses into geldings, and using a very obnoxious method to also deal with female horses, and that is by inserting, whoever is doing it, by inserting his whole arm, the forearm, into the vagina of the mare, and then cutting a slit in the wall, and then inserting the hand through the slit to locate the ovaries and destroying them where they were by means of a tool with a loop that can be tightened. So,
that's horrific.
So we are totally, absolutely opposed to permanent sterilization of both males and females, and we are in support of using short-term contraception and that is needed. A lot of people are opposed to it, and you know, there's these two big camps of birth control about horses and anti-birth control, and I will have to get into that in a bit. But the HSUS, the ASPCA, and the RTF, Return to Freedom, so-called, and about 50 different interest groups have come up with this solution of 10 years to AML by rounding up 15 to 20,000 horses and dealing with them in either one of these two ways, and it would be a combination of these two ways. And one way or the other, it would cost $20 somewhat million for helicopters and about $35 million for building and running more and more holding facilities and or doing very brutal permanent sterilization in the field. Using contraception takes a lot. It's a lot more subtle and a lot more delicate, and I'm not sure that they want to go that route because it is, you know, not fast enough for them, probably.
Right. So basically what I'm hearing is that they're warehousing these horses in holding pens with no real plan for the future. I know there are adoption programs, but let's face it, there are horse rescues across the country that are already dealing with people's abuse and neglect of domestic horses. And, you know, a horse is a major commitment and a major expense. So I don't see all these adoptive homes opening up for wild horses who, you know, are not trained, and it would take a lot of money to train them to, you know, turn them into riding horses. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like this so-called solution is not a solution, because now you've got a bunch of wild horses that have been separated from their families. Some of them have died in the process, and they're in holding pens, and now we're just going to feed them for their natural lifetime, which could be 20 years, 30 years.
That's
it
right.
doesn't seem like much of a solution for anybody.
No. So it is, and you know, to give you a direct answer, there's no plan past this, past forward. In other words, there's nothing in front of it that they're going towards. So
yeah, we're not going too far forward. We're just going into the point where we put them in a pen, and then there's nothing. There's nothing else to the plan.
You know, and they would kind of stop by the time, you know, after about 10 years or so, after the population has been forced back down to 27,000 reproductive members.
And I just want to say, having observed having been lucky enough to observe horses in the wild, it's heartbreaking to me to think of them being denied their freedom to just live their lives and to spend the rest of their lives in these holding pens without their family bands and without their natural interactions, and just being warehoused is a brutal end to a magnificent life. And I think it's very distressing. Is it better than slaughter? I guess, but not much better. I mean, is that a life? It's not really a life.
Not much of a life, because I have observed particularly there's a pretty big one near Reno, Nevada. It's called the Palomino Valley Holding Facility, and it hosts hundreds and hundreds of horses there. But they're all corrals, and the horses are densely packed into there. I would say, you know, for a certain enclosure, if the horses practice a 6-foot social distancing, they will fill up. You know, they would pretty much fill up the entire corral, so they have room to walk around in, and they are listless. They don't seem to have any spirit in them as what we see of horses in the wild, and they have there are certain of the natural behaviors that I very often see in the wild that I don't see or haven't seen in these holding facilities, and that is horses grooming each other. I haven't seen. And I can show you the pictures that I've taken at random. There's almost no incidents in which I can see two horses grooming each other. They're all just standing around. And sometimes, if they've sort of, you know, formed into a sort of loose kind of herd, then the leading mare would run from one end of the corral to the other, and then a whole bunch of horses would follow that lead mare. with nowhere to go really. So it is a heartbreaking scene. Now, quantitatively, originally in the first few years, all the horses captured by the BLM after 1971 were adopted, but after a while, it began to level off, and it leveled off at approximately 7% of all the horses captured by the BLM. So that means 93% of the horses captured by the BLM had nowhere to go, and
They don't
were
get
then,
adopted.
yeah, and
Wow.
so they have two different types of holding facilities. One is the short-term corral type, which is where the neutering and stuff like that is done, and then there are the long-term holding pastures that the BLM leases from farmers in surrounding states that don't have natural horses, wild horses of their own, like Oklahoma, Nebraska, those farming states where people own large pieces of pasture, and the BLM would lease these pastures from them and put the processed horses into them for life. That's it, just forgotten in there. And I don't know how much vet care they have, because if they're grazing in a rich pasture of rich grass, they may develop foot problems and stuff like that, and I don't know whether they are receiving adequate vet care. But one way or the other is very expensive, between feeding the land, the feed, the medication, the vet bills. So all in all, in the last few years, in the few years before 2018, the general expense would be that the BLM would have an annual budget of approximately between 70 million to 80 million. It's been moved up to a little bit over 80 million in 2019. And these $80 million may seem a large amount of money, but they've been all sucked dry by, number one, the holding facilities, and number two, by the helicopter expenses, which means of the $80 million in the annual budget, about $70 million plus are sucked dry by the helicopter rounding horses up, and the holding facilities taking care of the wild horses, so that it is said that only about 1% of the BLM's annual budget is spared for actual productive field work. 1% of the $80 million they have per year is completely committed to helicopter and holding facilities. Now, and so this is why the HSUS plan is so expensive, and it is so brutal, and actually not very intelligent, because basically, okay, in my opinion, any plan with an intrinsic component of rounding up horses is automatically classifies themselves as obsolete upon inception, because that's what we need to get away from. That is what is causing the problem in the first place, and they're just doing it even more. And all these and endless year by year demand for money that the Congress either do not want to part with, or don't have the resources to part with, and have to pull money from somewhere else, including the military. And of course, certain people in power don't value the wild horses as we do, and they will probably put it in the back burner, or second, third tier of importance. So all in all, this is what we have right now, is this system called 10 Years To AML. We're supposed to tolerate the BLM going to round up horses, 15 at least 1,000 horses per year at our expense, because the $21 million come from the taxpayers' dollars.
Right,
and we're
right.
opposed to it. We're opposed to it. So, and then the $35 million, and just watch, the Congress will have to come up with it, is to do these sterilization, and also building more facilities and rounding up more and dumping them into it. And that is a death spiral that will end with the horses extinction, in my humble opinion. And also massive slaughter, because after a while there'll be so many horses in captivity, and they would be so expensive to maintain. Right now, they've got 47 to 50 thousand, and if you keep on grabbing 15,000 per year, you're gonna, make it up to about 100,000 in a few years, and then where you're gonna find the extra money? It's gonna get more and more expensive every year too. So that is the end of the wisdom. And do you have any questions about?
Yeah, well,
the plan?
I have more of an observation. My observation would be that large national animal welfare organizations like HSUS and ASPCA have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal. And I think that gives them a false perception that anything that they're involved with must be humane, anything that they're involved with must be, the right decision. And what I've found over decades of being involved in animal welfare and animal protection is that really the people who are boots on the ground, who are doing the work, who are usually associated with much smaller grassroots organizations, they really know what's going on, and they really have excellent solutions. And I think that the general public needs to be made aware that the large national organizations should always be questioned about what exactly is going on. Just because they put their stamp of approval on something doesn't mean that it's good. And I found that out over years and years of doing this type of work. And I think it's unfortunate that people still support these organizations who, number one, don't really need your money, and number two, aren't doing the right thing for animals in certain instances, where smaller organizations who really don't have that much money could really use the help. So I'm just encouraging everyone to, as they say, shop local, support local, support a small organization that you can see what they're doing, because these larger organizations usually get involved in causes that they're not really doing much about, yet they're claiming a lot of credit and putting their name on things, and that's how they make their donation money. So that's my little public service announcement about who the animal welfare and animal protection community should be supporting. And I think that there are other solutions that are very effective, that are being put forth by much smaller organizations. Like in Arizona, the Salt River Wild Horse Management Group is an excellent example. And I know that there are other organizations like the American Wild Horse Campaign that are opposing these plans, and they deserve to be heard because they do offer some concrete solutions that aren't going to cost billions of dollars, over time. And I know, Anthony, your plan that you're putting forth is a much better one, and a much more sound, actual, real solution that protects the horses in a much more meaningful way. So I'm hoping that you can explain a bit more about what your vision is for a reform, I guess that's the right word, a reform of the BLM, and a true path forward that makes sense for, for people, for horses, and for the cattle industry.
Yes, I can fill in a couple of tiny vacuums. Number one, in general, I would advise people who have money to spare to donate to these causes, to support, as you say, support local or support the grassroots, because they're the ones on the ground, they're the ones fighting on the front line, and the small groups, the leaders are on the front line. They're not rear admirals as the big ones are, sitting at the back directing the little guys in front to do this and that at a certain salary. So basically, I wouldn't want to say there's all of them, but there's a high percentage of people who are in career pursuits in these big groups than in the small groups, who are there for the cause and for the animals. And for example, in these big groups, you have to live with that. For every $100 to donate, $50 would go into organizational upkeep, real estate, property management, salaries. Speaking of which, the CEO of the HSUS, I'm not quite sure how much she is paid today, but in previous years, it was in the region of about $250,000 a year.
I think that's a little low, Anthony. I think the last I heard was about 450,000 a year.
Could be. And even their executive secretaries are over in six figures. So basically the point is that, you know, a lot of your donation dollars go into people's bank accounts, and whether they deserve it or not. And, you know, I would contend that nobody in this particular, involved in this cause should be raking in six figures, really. I mean, you know, lots of people in small groups who are doing exemplary work are paid maybe $25,000, $30,000 a year, not $300,000 a year, $400,000 a year. The biggest one that I can name years ago was the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the CEO there was paid himself rather $750,000 a year. So that's money stolen from the animals, as far as I'm concerned. So support small groups with low overhead and with a huge spirit that hasn't been extinguished by money.
Yes, and that are actually doing good work, because when you look at the hands-on work of some of these larger organizations, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and they're not actually doing anything. That's just my perception and my experience.
And these groups they're also somehow forced into compromises with lots and lots of other entities. Because if you're big enough, then they would have to deal with the cattle ranchers. They would have to deal with the factory farmers doing chicken, eggs, and dairy farmers and so on. And they have to, and they cannot be abolitionists. They have to be compromising. So, you know, they'll be spending millions of dollars into increasing the cage size of hens, egg-laying hens by, you know, 15% or something like that. I mean, millions of dollars to increase the case size by 15%. I mean,
yeah, that's not a victory.
No, that is a total waste of money as far as I'm concerned. So, well, I mean, the 15% would probably be enjoyed by the hens to whatever extent they could. I'm sorry to laugh about that because it's so ridiculous.
No, it's a horrible thing, and there's always the argument between what's the difference between animal rights and animal welfare, and I think you just hit the nail on the head that we're not asking for bigger cages, we're asking for no cages.
Yeah,
so
that's right. And so anyway, that's the situation. Now let me go into my plan and see how things would work out.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's very exciting to me.
From your point of view, okay. Now,
yes,
their plan is cattle oriented, and I don't care whether it's cattle oriented or not. My plan would benefit the horses, even though we are forced to accept a certain amount of cattle in the public lands, because if you drive for zero population of cattle, then you'll never get there. So what I'm driving at is a limited increase for the horses, so that they don't have to be subjected to this horrible treatment. And that is this. Number one, it is, if you go into Google and do Google search for images and for graphs of cattle population on public lands, you will see a gradual decrease. From, if you draw a graph from 1970 to 2020, you'll see that the graph is gradually decreasing as the years go on. So it is not a big revolution to decrease the cattle population by a certain percent. And actually, I will contend that since the cattle population has been decreasing over the years, where is your rationale, BLM, to hold on to the 27,000 maximum for the horses when the cattle population has actually decreased from 37 to 1 to 20 to 1? I mean, are you trying to have the cake and eat it too, so that you can have the public land instead of giving it back to the horses, to give it to the oil companies, to give it to fracking? You know, I mean, that's all public. Everybody's contending for their own use of the public land, and BLM is kind of in bed with almost everybody. So my solution would be this. Okay, number one, since the cow population has been decreasing, and we can actually prove it by scientifically counting them, and the cattle population can be determined by paperwork. That the cattle population has decreased since the time when the BLM determined that the horses should be 27 maximum. I would contend that since the cattle population has declined, then the horse population can increase because the land can support it. So forget about the oil companies, BLM, because you're not supposed to be looking after them. You're supposed to be looking after the horse population. That's one of your job descriptions, BLM. So what I'm going to contend is that I will, if the BLM says, okay, well, there's so many cattle, I'll say, okay, whatever the number, your figure is about 2 million, and we'll play with 2 million. And I'm saying you can drop the cattle population by approximately 12%. And that will create enough room for all the horses in existence, whether be they on range or whether be they in corrals. So 12% of 2 million cows is approximately 250,000 cows to be removed from 2 million. And that will create enough room for 12,000 horses. Because each horse is equal to 2 cows. So if we reduce the cow population by 250,000, we are creating room for 125,000 extra horses. Do you understand that first at this point, Lynda?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, so we are creating more room for the horses by reducing the cow population by 12%. And in doing so, we're actually increasing the horse AML by 600% by raising it from 27,000 as it stands up to 150,000 by adding on approximately 120,000 by reducing the number of cows to make this room for the horse. Does it make sense? So if we raise the AML, or the maximum allowable number for the wild horses, from 27,000 up to 150,000, then all the 90,000 extant wild horses on the range can remain, which means the helicopters can be grounded forever. And we have raised the AML, or the maximum allowable number, to 150,000 for the horses from 27,000. We can also, and given only 90,000 wild horses on the range, we have approximately 60,000 vacancy left. And that can accommodate all the captive wild horses behind in the corrals, which currently is about 50,000. So we can release all 50,000 wild horses onto the range. Added to the 90,000 is only 140,000. We have reset the maximum to 150,000. That means we have 10,000 below the reset maximum allowable population for adjustment. And this adjustment is required. We can't just release the horses back onto the land and leave them be, because there's still a lot of people in the wild horse movement who say, stop messing around with nature, just let the horses find their own equilibrium. That does not work. That works only if there are natural predators. In the absence of the natural predators, something else would have to take that place to maintain the 100% instead of letting the horse go 115 or 120% per year. And so that would be the province of a temporary system, or a system of temporary contraception. And I am not specifying any particular method as long as it is temporary, humane contraception that is reversible and that does not impact on the horse's long-term health and does not disturb the horse's natural herd behavior. And there are such technologies on the market right now. There are about 3 or 4 or 5 different choices. All have been studied and certified. And I have to give the HSUS back some credit for having done a lot of work in this area to experiment with these contraceptive methods. And the horses in the east, on the east coast, have been managed by one or more of these methods to the satisfaction of the biologists over there, that they are in a state of health and they're thriving in their natural habitat there, given the limited, what I call maintenance contraception, as opposed to the brutal, aggressive population suppression methods championed by the path forward of the HSUS and the SPCA and the Return to Freedom triad. So the MARR plan, first of all, will remove 120 cows from the land, raise the AML for the horses from 27,000 to 150,000, ground all the helicopters, no more roundup, leave the 90,000 horses be, and return all the captive horses from the holding facilities back onto the land, making a total population of 140 approximately, with 10,000 headroom for adjustments. And as long as we can maintain, or the BLM's new retrained forces can maintain the horse population below 150,000 in total, there is no need and no excuse for any roundup or even the need for any adoption. So we will use mild maintenance contraception with the best method available at the time to achieve that, and there's nothing inhumane about that. And some of the methods in existence can do it. So the opposition in this scheme would just have to be contented with, and the big bad organization in this is strangely an animal rights organization called Friends of Animals, so-called Friends of Animals. I had once a white-tailed deer birth control campaign going in Ohio because they were having a urban deer overpopulation problem. They were going to cull 50% of the deer population in the city of Solon in Ohio. So they had approximately 1,000 white-tailed deer in the urban area in which firearms discharge is not allowed. So either you use bow hunting, and the bow hunters would be very happy to oblige, or you hire somebody, some kind of professional animal killer, like somebody called White Buffalo. And to crop off 50% of that, that means 500. And we were fighting a campaign using contraceptive to replace culling, because culling is self-perpetuating. Because if you cull 50% of the population of the deer, then the amount of food available to them would double, and then they would double the reproductive rate, and the bang population would go back to the overpopulated number to begin with. So we were actually almost winning in that fight using contraception versus culling, and at the crucial point, Friends of Animals charged in from left field and sided with the hunters and cullers against us, and of course we got defeated. And their philosophy is to let nature be without interfering, and the result is that that species that they want to protect becomes overpopulated, and once again you've got to go back in. And in fact, there was somebody using that philosophy to run a wild horse sanctuary without contraception, and it ended up to be for the horses to be emaciated and had to be taken back by the BLM. Somebody had a ranch that BLM gave 800 horses to take care of, and they had to be taken back because they did not practice contraception on the horses. So
right. I think there are a lot of people out there who just feel like humans should not intervene in wildlife issues, but what they fail to realize is that we've already intervened to the point of no return. We've developed all of their habitat. You know, everything that we do affects wildlife. So we can't just throw up our hands and say, let nature take its course, because we've already completely disrupted the balance of nature. So that's not an option.
Let me tell you what let nature take its course means. What nature takes its course means no roundup, of course, and also no contraception. And then the species population would grow by 10, 15, 20%. And sooner or later, it would hit the wall in terms of the biological carrying capacity of that piece of land. And what happens then would be that the overpopulated population would overconsume on the resources, including damaging the ecology of the actually pretty delicate ecology of the semi-desert environment.
Right, and with the wild horses, we're up against a situation where the BLM is calling the shots. So our task is to come up with the most humane, less invasive plan that we can come up with. And PZP as a form of contraception is a lot less invasive than surgery. And it's also reversible if need be, so that we're not permanently sterilizing these animals.
They will come up with opposition to you, to your argument, but the opposition is usually almost always anecdotal, like one or two cases here and there. You know,
right.
Here's a foal that is deformed, and here's a mare that has gone out of sync of the reproductive cycle, and things like that. But it's and here's another foal with crooked legs, but the crooked leg one has been attributed to a certain deformation illness. I can't exactly remember what it's called, but it impacts the new foals, and so there was no statistic that they present as to how many horses are affected by every 1,000 that you contracept. So
right. Well, I think it's a risk-benefit analysis, as in any other situation, and
yeah, that's right.
I think that the benefits for the horses far outweigh. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure they would rather deal with that than deal with helicopters and holding pens and surgery in the field.
You cannot escape one of these scenarios. Number one, you do nothing, and the horse and the horse population reproduce unchecked, hits the wall, damages the environment, and thereby decreasing its carrying capacity in the long run. And then that piece of land will support fewer horses, and then you've got to capture more. So that is that kind of thing that's happening. So according to my plan, then no such problem will exist if we do the mild maintenance contraception to keep the total population down below 150,000. And how we distribute all these returned or set free captive horses would be to study every single herd. And number one, the BLM should have a record as to which horse it was captured from. We can return them back to the herd, and even if not, we can introduce horses into different herds, and in fact having some genetic benefit to it by spreading the genes around. And we will also work on increasing the AML of each HMA to make it at least 250 per herd, so that they would not go into the inbreeding mode. So right. Now the kicker, the economic kicker is this, and this is very important for Congress, because Congress, its number one concern is money. The Congress does not love the horse; it loves the money that it can save. If you can save them money by producing the same result, so the MARR plan can save them money by producing an even better result. So it's a double-barrel benefit that they have so far turned a deaf ear to, because they're beholden to these big organizations and the BLM itself The BLM doesn't want to change because all the personnel are tuned to capturing and I mean, you know, if they adopt a new plan like the MARR plan, they have to they don't necessarily have to lay off a lot of people, but they have to retain a lot of people, and that would be a big problem. You know, it would be a total restructuring of the BLM, but wouldn't be a renovation of the old one. It's like building a new house with a new blueprint and not making any reference to the old blueprint that didn't work. So the old blueprint says, you know, you've got a roundup, and the path forward plan is abiding by that. We're not. So we're grounding the helicopter forever, but keeping all the horses on land, on the range, and then by returning all the horses off range to constitute this new, larger, and more stable and more genetically healthy population. And the important thing for the Congress, as I said, is money. And if we release all the horses from the holding facilities, do we still need those holding facilities? No, we do not. So we can cancel them all, delete them, and we can save approximately $50 or $60 million right there. And then by grounding the helicopter, we can save $20, $30 million a year. So altogether, by taking the MARR plan, we can save for the BLM $60 to $70 million out of their original $18 million budget without any new requests for extra funding. And in fact, they are saving $60 to $70 million and return their budget back to $80 million. No more helicopters, no more holding facilities. They can commit the entire budget to the field. So actually, it is going to engender a lot of extra employment because there is so much work to be done that they're not doing right now because they don't have the money for it to hire people for it. But you know, with a full intact $80 million a year, what can they not do? And a part of that they can do is to persuade whichever rancher that have to remove some cattle from the land to give them a little sweet deal, a one-time sweet deal to pacify them, and you know, for example, they can with all the holding pastures vacated by the wild horses being held there, being released, they can put a whole bunch of cows into those holding pastures, and it's richer grazing, so they can put more cows per unit area into these holding pastures at small cost. And if they have to overflow into private grazing at $20 per cow per year, then the BLM could subsidize them that way. And with $80 million at its disposal, it would be actually a very small, insignificant sum that can make things work. And so Congress will be happy because, you know, BLM doesn't have to go back to them to say, okay, well, this year we need $20 million to have extra. That's over and above the $80 million. We need $20 million extra for helicopters to round up more horses and $35 extra million to build more holding facilities. We don't have to bug Congress at all for a single cent. Congress will see BLM have the intact $80 million committed to the field, and the work shall be done. And the work that needs to be done right now is to get the MARR plan into being a contender against the path forward in Congress. And we explain to them how you can save the $21 million committed to the BLM for helicopters, and you can save the $35 million they're going to ask you for, and you can keep the $80 million for the BLM, and that's it, period. And the horses will be a lot happier, live in peace. We will be a lot happier to see the horses live in peace, and the BLM will be happier because we no longer bash them. So it will be happy for everyone.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
The only people that may not be totally happy would be the ranchers, but you know, as I said, the BLM could put together a sweetheart deal for them. It's not my way of dealing with offenders, but I mean that for the sake of the horses, I would go for it. And and it doesn't have to be permanent. It can be a one-time farewell deal, and a new equilibrium will be that. So that's it. So all we need to do then is to get the MARR plan to be looked at by the Congress and have one congressperson champion it in Congress to make it a bill. That's it.
So what can people do to make that happen? What kind of support do you need? What should we be doing? Should we be contacting our senators and representatives and get the plan in front of them? What's the next steps?
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. Is for everyone to contact their own Congress people and senators and to present to them the MARR plan, and we will prepare a package for them to present. You don't have to write anything; just send it to their own Congress people. Originally, I was going to do a continental tour for the MARR plan, but it was cut short partly by a vehicular breakdown, but also by the coronavirus. We can no longer make presentations in public places. So what we will have to do then would be to do a virtual tour to persuade people in all the voting districts to write to their own members of Congress, and hopefully at least one congressperson will take it on.
Great. And I would propose that there are smaller grassroots organizations that are willing to help. Volunteers have been out darting horses with PZP in a number of different states, and I think that that's an overlooked aspect of the solution, is that there are people willing to be boots on the ground and be out there doing the work at no cost to taxpayers, funded by public donations
that would
and
be
fundraising.
Great.
Yeah,
that would be great. But let me point out this: there's something even better, and that is, instead of these people having to work for nothing to be volunteers, the BLM now would need people in the field to do this, to execute the MARR plan. They would need to employ people widely to do this throughout the public plans, throughout all the HMAs, and there will be employment opportunities, and volunteers may get paid.
Right,
and that's BLM takes it on.
There's a lot of people looking for work. I would definitely apply for that job.
That's right, definitely. And so would I. So maybe I'll maybe we'll work together again in the field somewhere.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah,
but no, it's a very good solution, I think. So yeah, okay. I hope everybody can rally around and go to your website, which is marrplan.org with a hyphen between MARR and plan, and look at look into all this information for yourself, and then get on the phone and write some letters and send some emails to our elected officials and ask them to stop these roundups that are counterproductive and costing millions and millions of dollars, and do what's right for the horses and what the public wants, and let them stay wild and free. I mean, they're an iconic symbol of the American West. We're so lucky to have them still. I feel that way about any wildlife that's been eradicated throughout the country. In the small pockets where they still exist, we need to do our best to protect them and let them live, instead of human beings paving over everything and making it our own.
Yeah, it would be just heartbreaking if the wild horse is missing from the land.
Yeah, it would.
As heartbreaking as if the tigers are missing from India.
Yeah, so, and I know here in Arizona currently, and every year, we have a huge problem with wildfires, and the wild horses grazing keeps the brush down and helps with that. And as you said, there are lots of different ecological benefits to having them. And they go into areas where the cows don't. So
that's right. I would go farther too with the MARR plan by not limiting it to the public lands, but to have it include some lands that wild horses can benefit. For example, in California, with all these horrible wildfires, if we introduce some wild horses in there to graze off the forest floor, then some of that wildfires wouldn't even be there. So there's a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for taking the time today to explain everything to me and to anyone who's listening on all the different facets of this. But, you know, just the bottom line to sum up, I would say that historically what we've done hasn't worked. The new plan, despite being backed by some major animal protection organizations, is very, very flawed, both from a cost perspective and from a wild horse perspective. And the new plan that you're putting forth seems doable, but it's going to take public pressure. That's the only thing that's ever saved animals, and it's the only thing that ever will. So I for one, will be writing to my representatives in Congress and the Senate, and I hope that everyone else will be too.
Actually, one more thing that we've done is that we have by the way, here's a little story here. In 2018, when the crisis came down, the BLM and actually got together with the HSUS bunch behind closed doors, and the HSUS bunch presented their plan to the BLM in the summer, sometime behind closed doors of 2018, and so they have not only do they have the inside track, they're the only racer in the race. So it is not until February of 2019, months after they have presented their plan to the BLM, did I conceive of the MARR plan. And then in March of 2019, I launched a petition on change.org, and that petition has so far garnered 13,000 signatures, I believe. And I'm not even pushing that petition anymore, but now it still have 13,000 somewhat signatures on it. So if it helps, I can give you the link to it too, so you can also present that to government. If people are sending things to them, then they can include that. With 13,000 signatures and hundreds and hundreds of excellent comments on it.
Sure, yeah, that would be great. Maybe you could post it on your website so that everyone can find it.
Sure thing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you for going to bat for the horses as you've gone to bat for other species, you know, in your life, and you've been able to really help out. And hopefully now we can rally together and get behind this plan and get it into action.
Well, I have to return a compliment. You're doing excellent work. When I first met you back in New Jersey, I believe it was 2005 or something. But that was actually a high point of that tour of mine, which covered 44 states in about 7 months. In New Jersey, there I met some great people that I'm still in contact with, and I'm certainly have been working with Lynda in the recent months, particularly in regards to the COVID-19 thing too. So
Yeah.
good luck to you. Good luck to you all, and let's all survive this, and so that we can live to fight another battles.
Yes, always. Thank you again, Anthony. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye bye.
Bye bye.